Without further ado, Leanne Wiseman is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Professor of Law here at Griffith University. She's also chair of the Australian Repair Network, and as we mentioned before, they've just organised their symposium in Canberra in the third year running, so we're going to hear a little bit about that. Her research expertise focuses on the intersection between law and new technologies, with particular attention to balancing IP rights with genuine access to information. And she's currently researching legal and regulatory responses to the international right to repair movement. And she now has the floor for the next 40 minutes or so, and we're really looking forward to getting a full education. Please make Leanne welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mel and Julian from the ADM+S Centre for being here. I'm glad to be part of this event. I feel very privileged, and I'd also like to thank the ARC for funding my research in this area. It's been an amazing journey, and because I get to work with people like Kyle Weens from iFixit and Nathan Proctor, who we've heard from today, Willie Cade in agricultural machinery, Anthony Rosborough in Canada, Gay Gordon Byrne in the US as well, but also all my European counterparts in the right to repair movement. It's a fantastic group of people, and we're doing the best that we can across a whole range of things. So just in that context, I'd like to speak about Australia, but just as a broad observation, I thought I would share with you the European right to repair movement has been going for a very long time, but it's very much about environmental sustainability, and I know that that is really the theme today. We've seen the eco-design regulations, they're regulating batteries, so it's always been about the environmental consequences of consumption, more so than any other legal regime particularly. In the US, we see a contrast. It's very much a consumer rights focused movement. You'll see it's state-based, as Nathan showed us. Each state is approaching it based on a model law that started off in Massachusetts in 2012. Canada and Australia are probably more aligned. But what we're seeing in Australia, we have quite a unique regulatory response to the issues around repairability and the inability to repair. So we draw a little bit from the European context, but also the American consumer-focused right to repair movement. So I thought I would share with that context with you as we go through the journey. So starting off with the theme, environmental sustainability. Fortunately, we now have a Federal Minister for the Environment, Tanya Plibersek, and only in October last year, we heard her, with her state Ministers of Environment counterpart, prioritise keeping our materials in use. This is one of the 3 bullet points. We've just heard that there's been a global summit announced by the Federal Department on nature repair that will be held in Sydney, funded by the federal government. But essentially, repair obviously is about reduction of waste. If we are to attempt to reduce our waste by 80% by 2030, which is the targets that Australia is speaking about, obviously the elephant in the room is consumption, but obviously repairability has a large role to play. The difficulty that we have from a regulatory policy perspective is Australia has been obsessed with recycling. The investment that has gone into recycling, and that is not to say that recycling is bad. Recycling is fantastic. It's a very expensive exercise, but really what I will highlight to you today is recycling really needs to be a last resort option rather than the first point of call. So Professor Aaron Perzanowski, author of not only The End of Ownership, a book that if you're interested in subscription models and discussion, his book with Jason Schultz is a fantastic book to read, but also author of The Right to Repair book, Cambridge University Press, an excellent overview of the right to repair across a whole range of facets. So Aaron has said repair is inevitable. We know that it's essential. Everything breaks. Software, hardware, all of the devices. So we do need to keep our things in use, and this is very much the environmental, urgency that we have around that. We've heard a lot about electronics, but really just to broaden out the discussion, what I'm going to speak about today is really a very, very broad range of industries. We're talking agricultural industries here in Australia. Farmers can't fix their tractors. We're talking all consumer goods and appliances, essentially smart goods and appliances in your home, your white goods, your appliances, your dishwasher, your kettle, your car, our medical equipment and devices, and more importantly, assistive technologies. This is a huge, spoken of problem. People who use a whole range of assistive technologies, some low tech, some very high tech, but the inability and the barriers that they face to keeping those products in use is just unbelievable, really, and it really goes just to a human rights argument around accessibility and equity of participation in our societies. So it's also touching upon B2B. This is something that often when we hear the US kind of right to repair rhetoric, it is around a consumer right, as if it is a consumer's problem, that we can't fix the things that we buy because we're consumers, and it's an OEM problem, it's a manufacturer's problem. We do have to recognise the imbalance and the information asymmetry that exists between manufacturers and us as consumers about the products and goods we buy. It is very much a B2B issue as well. Airlines, banks, educational institutions being held hostage to things like software updates to the platforms that they're adopting and using. So it is not just a consumer issue, it is very much a universal issue. Newer industries that have come since we've been running the Australian Repair Summit, as Mel said, since 2021, when the Productivity Commission was investigating the barriers to repairability in Australia. Large, heavy cleaning equipment, mining equipment, military, heavy machinery, all of these industries are facing similar challenges that we face with our iPhones. So we've heard a lot today, and MC's last talk, I'll touch a little bit upon automotive, but there is more than environmental sustainability at stake here. There's economic waste. It's a huge issue about having to buy new and not having what we call an aftermarket or a valid secondary market. So the after-sales monopolies that we see in all sectors is really more valuable in some cases, as we see, than the original sale of the object or the item or the machine or the device itself. So we're talking about subscription model features in cars, but you forget that the car is the second most expensive thing that most people buy. You buy a house, you buy a car, and that's why you need to keep it working. You pay the $80,000 or sometimes $100,000 for a farmer, as Nathan said, it's $800,000 for their equipment and machinery, but then you're then being told to add on, subscription fees for things that you have already purchased and own. And this is really what Aaron Persinowski is talking about when we talk about the end of ownership. But what's really important when we talk about competition in aftermarkets, and we've seen this in our Australian automotive repair market, Australia does not make cars, but we fix cars. It's $166 billion industry in Australia fixing cars. It's huge. So it is making sure that there's fair and open competition in those markets. There's no price fixing, the availability and reasonable cost of spare parts, but this issue of interoperability. You break your windscreen, MC spoke about sensors and things. You break your windscreen when you're travelling around Australia. Because of the sensors in those windscreens, you cannot pick up a windscreen from your local repairer anywhere because it will not talk to the rest of your car. We have specific challenges in Australia that we share with Canada in terms of access to authorised repairers. It is unlike the US. Farmers can travel a couple of miles to see John Deere. Wheat farmers in Wickerpin in Western Australia travel days to be able to access authorised repairers. So it's really significant to have open competition in these markets. And we know that some markets will not self-correct without intervention. And this is really what I'm looking at in terms of the regulatory and policy responses that we need to happen. It's also about our consumer rights. It's something that's not often spoken about, but when we buy our goods, whether it's a car, equipment in our home, devices, we all know that comes with that a manufacturer's warranty. What's really interesting is this touches upon product lifespan, product durability. No manufacturer will tell us how long your fridge should last. Why shouldn't they be required to tell us that? But we buy a fridge and we're very lucky if we get a 2-year warranty, and we're often upsold a 5-year warranty, when we know that a fridge that costs $4,500 should last for 7 to 10 years, and in our parents' generation would last for 30 to 40 years. So this goes at the very heart of what are our rights under the manufacturer's warranties, what are our rights under our Australian consumer law. We have consumer law guarantees that says if a product is not fit for purpose, if it's not merchantable, you have rights over and above the manufacturer's warranty. So this overlay of our, the short-term manufacturer's guarantee over products, our underlying consumer rights, where there is really some people understand them very well. I understand my consumer rights very well, but when my microwave breaks down, I don't get any joy from Samsung about getting that repaired if it's out of their manufacturer's warranty, even though I know I have consumer rights under the ACL. I don't have the ability to sue Samsung, which is what you basically have under our ACL, our Australian consumer laws. So what really rights are they? Where I'm come to the right to repair is really the barrier that intellectual property plays to this. At the heart of a lot of the barriers to repairability or the right to repair are the IP rights. Speaking to manufacturers and seeing their opposition to repair and the right to repair across the globe, you can broadly group their opposition into categories. One is you cannot repair these items, goods, machines, devices because you will kill yourselves or others. The other one is it is our intellectual property. And that's a fantastic that's as simple as it comes. We've heard it. Last year we had a panel on assistive technology and medical device repair. We had a representative from the Medical Technology Manufacturers Association, and basically that was their argument. You will kill yourselves and it's our IP. I'm glad that I can come in the IP argument and say, well, that's great, let's break that down, let's talk about that. What are you talking about? Is it your patents? Is it your trademarks? Is it your copyright? What is it? This image is from the Productivity Commission's report into the right to repair, and if you're really interested in it in Australia, we are the only country in the world that has had a government appointed economic think tank to do an open public consultation about barriers to repair. So Australia is in quite a unique position. The Federal Trade Commission in the US has done Nixing the Fix report looking at competition issues, but this was an open 12-month inquiry, probably I think 200 to 300 submissions from manufacturers, a whole range of stakeholders impacted by barriers to repair, as well as public hearings. So that report is a really useful report to get a kind of global capture of the barriers that Australians share, but you will see that most of the submissions that came were coming from people in companies from Europe and America, global giants who are saying you can't have that here in Australia either, for the same reasons that are being run in different jurisdictions. But when we look at IP, look at this tractor. This is a great example of the fact that the Productivity Commission chose to use something that's not really thought of as an IP kind of tool. But this is similar to MC's point, is that there is so much information, software and IP that sits in this one machine. I know from working with farmers in Australia that a lot of farmers have two tractors, at least two tractors on their farm. One that's a very high-tech smart tractor, usually a John Deere, that the bank and the insurance company is very happy to provide finance because it shows that they're a good modern farmer. and they have their old kind of 1970s farmer tractor, that when this one breaks down, they can actually open the hood and keep it going because they can't deal with that one. They're the kind of decisions and issues that farmers need to make when there's a hailstorm coming and you're about to harvest. You can't wait for telematics. You cannot wait for an authorised repairer to come and provides parts or spare information. So we have copyright, trade secrets, the onboard software, everything in a tractor, and it just gives you a bit of an idea of what The Economist recognised. So our Productivity Commission, as I said, it's the economic think tank, but they were really looking at and they were asked to look at by the Federal Treasurer, what are the barriers to repair? And they found that there are a number of unnecessary barriers to repair in Australia, and that there was importance to giving independent repairers greater access to repair supplies, fostering competition for repair services that would not necessarily compromise safety or discourage innovation, because they're the concerns. We invest all this money in R&D. If you don't let us lock up our devices, then innovation will stop. Interestingly, the World Intellectual Property Organisation, the UN body, measures innovation through the number of IP rights registered. So when you hear them talk about innovation, what does innovation look like? They will show the number of patents that are registered, the number of design rights that are registered, or the number of trademarks that are registered. Not whether they're good patents or good design rights, not that the limitations and exceptions on those rights. IP has always been about balance. It's always been about creating rewards and incentive, but it's always been about providing access and balance to those in the community, the public, to access those innovations. Interestingly, WIPO does not recognise that there are some examples where we're seeing everyday end-use licence agreements overriding all of those limitations and exceptions in our intellectual property regime. So private contracts overriding public policy is never clearer than in intellectual property law. They made a number of strong recommendations. There's 16 of them sitting there. I'm just going to run through them with you. But basically, they're across three broad areas. Recognition that we need to enhance consumer rights, and there's a whole raft of those within there. Essentially, we have, under the Australian consumer laws, the inability to impose penalties upon manufacturers who breach them. That's kind of, what's the point of a law that has no enforcement mechanisms? One of the questions. But you'll see that there's enhancing consumer rights, promoting competition and enabling access to repair supplies. And also the last one is the kind of waste, environmental sustainability issue. So for Australia, it's very much a consumer rights focused, competition focused. You'll see IP is featured in that as well as the environmental. So we have this combination between the European approach and the US approach, and similarly some aspects of the Canadian approach. Just to give you a sense of who I've been talking to since I've started this work, we have 16 departments under our current federal government, and basically 14 of those are impacted by repair. So if you look through all of those departments, and this is one of, it sounds fantastic, look at the interest that we would get from our federal government. It's also very much a weakness, because we have all those ministers pointing the finger at someone else saying, it's a federal environment minister's problem, it's a treasurer's problem, it's a attorney general's problem. So we're going really from one to the other. But we have, in the world of intellectual property, we're bound by, bilateral trade agreements and, international treaties as well, so that it even flags DFAT as well. So just running through, enhancing consumer rights, basically getting a guarantee that when you buy a product, you'll get software updates. It's like a no-brainer. We've heard that mentioned a couple of times this morning. That you should be able to have, for example, what we would call a super complaint, that if everybody who bought a particular brand of product and the same fault occurs in that class of products, and rather than giving rights to every individual to bring an action against a manufacturer, that peak bodies such as Choice could bring an action on their behalf, almost like a class action, but not a class action. It's a super complaint. You know, more information. We're really, as a purchaser of goods, most of you will know, I was found out yesterday with my Electrolux fridge when all the lights were on, my ice maker wasn't working. I phoned the helpline with Electrolux. They tell me, oh, you have to actually pull your fridge out, turn it off and on again, and then change the temperature, and then everything will reset. I had an interesting conversation about why that wasn't told to me at the point of purchase, and why it wasn't in their repair manual as well. So quite interesting. So we have had submissions, all of the arguments around consumer rights from our peak bodies is that we know as consumers that we're unable to get the outcomes that we need when things break across all product categories. We see recognition that you feel the onus of responsibility of taking problems upon yourself. Sorry, that's my bangle. So there has been documented by our peak bodies, and there's a lot of kind of research that's gone into this around the problems that we face as consumers. That's why Choice has said, you know, there's limited competition in markets. We know that this is not only consumer problem, but also the competition law problem. What's really interesting, I think, is a survey that was done by Choice about, you know, 85% of Australians say that buying products, you know, they expect that they'll be able to be lasting for a long time. It's very important to them. 73% say repairability is important. They want to keep, no one gets any joy out of buying a new fridge, washing machine, dishwasher. It's not a passion kind of project to go and replace your fridge. We just want them like our parents, the Westinghouse fridge that's now the beer fridge 35 years later. That's what we want, really. What's really interesting, I think, and this is something I said to the ACCC, so I'm happy to repeat this here, is that the ACCC recently has been releasing data around greenwashing. And look at the response we've had from the federal government. You know, there's action, there's things happening. The ACCC does not release any data about the complaints that they get for breaches of the consumer guarantees around merchantability of products and fitness for purpose. So even if you take your matter to the ACCC and say, I've bought this brand, it's constantly broken, they won't fix it, it's a lemon, you know, etc., none of that information is public, so we can't see the scale of the problem. This is one of the issues of regulators say, we love recycling because we can set targets and we meet them. Recycling, repair and reuse is really difficult. How do we set a target around that? So as a policy response, we don't know what it looks like. This is a concern. So even Choice highlighted the fact that regulators should be required to publicly report on defects and how much is breaking, how often, what are the categories of goods. Treasury looked at enhancing consumer rights. They were making some minor and practical amendments to the consumer laws in 2021. And, you know, amazingly, they're looking at introducing penalties for companies that breach. You know, that's outrageous. That was back in 2021. I haven't seen anything followed on from that. So really, in terms of the message around consumer rights, let's talk about the data. Let's see how we can get that data publicly available so that we can actually present to our regulators. This is a problem we all experience. Everyone that we speak to has either had a broken iPhone that they can't fix, laptop, you know, kitchen appliance, motor vehicle, medical equipment, whatever it is, but I don't know anyone who hasn't had those challenges and difficulties. So let's look at the competition. There's a whole raft of recommendations that the Productivity Commission made here. The one that I want to speak about and to follow on from MC's presentation is about the fantastic world-leading legislation that we have in Australia around automotive repair and access, mandatory data sharing. You'll see that some of the recommendations, particularly with respect to agricultural machinery, it was flagged that that scheme that we have, which I'll speak about in a minute, should be extended to bring in the agricultural machinery, because in our regional remote areas of Australia, most of the car mechanics are actually the ones fixing ag machinery in rural towns. And it's very much the same issue. It's access to diagnostic data and software that they need, that they can't currently have. So Australia does have its first right to repair law. It's a national law. And what's really fantastic about it is that it came through, Michael Sukar was the treasurer at the time, his dad was a mechanic, so I think there was an understanding about the inability to fix cars. As I said, Australia doesn't make cars, but we fix them. It's a very big industry. The Competition and Consumer Amendment Act, it's a motor vehicle service and repair information sharing scheme. It was passed in 2021. On screen are Stuart Charity, the CEO of the AAA, the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association, and Leslie Yates is their Government and Policy Officer, the two people largely responsible for this legislation. So what this legislation means is, as I said, it's an amendment to our Australian consumer law. This is fantastic, because what it does is override copyright law in diagnostic software for automotive repair. So how great is that? We have copyright law with all these limited exceptions, which we know the contracts override, but here we have, sneaking up the sideline, is a consumer law that overrides copyright for that particular purpose. It's magic. So with this legislation, our aftermarket, as I said, it's a huge market. It's now 16 billion in 2023. This mandatory data sharing scheme was proposed in 2020, passed into law in 2021, and it's been in operation for 12 months. One of the recommendations, it will be evaluated. It's one of my case studies as part of my future fellowship. But what this means is an independent repairer can take your car, whether it's a European car or a American car, and it can that mechanic can request access to the diagnostic software and data from the OEM car manufacturer, and at reasonable cost, within a reasonable period, and they can repair your car just as an authorised repairer would have been able to. So it just opens, all it does is open that market up, fair and open competition in the aftermarket. So basically how that legislation works is essentially 2021 we had the legislation passed. There's training requirements. It includes EVs. Interestingly, EVs are still very much like a car. They have four wheels, they have brakes, they have all the parts of a car. They also have the battery. So EVs, in some senses of car repair, are not that different because the repair is not happening often to the battery part. The cars are very much the same. Obviously, not with respect to the engine parts, but there's the physical components of the car. So essentially what this has set up is an independent body, ASRA, and that is really the body that will negotiate. It's really, I think, as a copyright person, it's like a compulsory license. They can't refuse to provide the information. There's 68 brands now participating. We have 68 brands here in Australia now, and I think they're just onboarding most of the global car companies. So how it operates, this looks a little bit complicated, but this is a scheme. The benefit of this legislative scheme is that the ACCC owns it. It now has a department of 7 or 8 people who are there to enforce it. There are fines of up to $10 million for breaches of this scheme. So if a global car manufacturer refuses to provide access to their diagnostic and software information through this scheme, there are potentially fines, and the ACCC will take the action. This changes the whole ball game. It doesn't rely upon the individual consumer or the car owner to take any action. It is a breach of this statutory scheme, and that is why we love it so much, that it's the ACCC, our competition authority, that is driving it. That is why we would love to bring all categories, agricultural machinery, medical devices, consumer electronics, into a scheme like this, because it has teeth. So there are, I think you can see, 33% participating car brands, and needless to say, Tesla is not in there, but they're slowly coming on board. There's 3,230 independent mechanics who are now part of this scheme getting access. 567 have got training around EVs. So what was interesting, the same argument from car manufacturers, was EVs are so different, they're so scary and they're so dangerous, no one can touch them. Interestingly, in Queensland, our recent electrical safety review has recommended that only electricians should touch EVs. Strange. That's currently where Queensland is at. But basically, the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association said, well, hang on, what do they need to know? And they've basically designed a course now. Most of it's online, but they do 3 or 4 units. It's a special course. So all independent mechanics who want to work on EVs do the appropriate training, and the manufacturers can dictate what they need to do in that. And then they're fine to go to work on the EVs. So this is this whole access to repair information that we're pushing for. So, as I said, this is a recommendation around agricultural machinery that we bring those under that same scheme. It's working well, it's a new scheme, there'll always be a little bit of teething problem that we move forward. We have, for those of you who are not familiar with tractors, John Deere, Case, Kubota, New Holland, different colours. That's really significant on a farm. If you're not understanding interoperability issues, you cannot put a blue thing to a red thing on a tractor on a farm. You cannot put a yellow, an orange to a green thing. So this is kind of, interoperability is at the heart of a lot of the kind of software embeddedness that we're seeing in all the products, is whether your windscreen talks to the sensors in your car. But we are talking, you cannot put certain combine harvesters to a different branded tractor because they just don't talk to each other. So we're talking this aftermarket, this competition issue in the aftermarket, it's such a significant barrier. So that's a recommendation that we have. We're currently negotiating, as Nathan would have said, John Deere and the Tractor Manufacturers Association of Australia have looked what's happening overseas. Colorado's got an agricultural right to repair piece of legislation. We're currently working with the NFF, negotiating an MOU around access to diagnostic software for Australian farmers. We'll see how that goes. What's interesting, just only on the 23rd of August, we have the Federal Treasury announcing a big competition law review for the next 2 years, looking at digital economies and everything. This is a 2-year project, which I think would take 2 years to kind of highlight all the competition issues that we're seeing across every product category in these markets around the aftermarket, access to repair tools and information being restricted in markets. So that's a kind of watching brief, and it's only just begun. So the IP, as I said, this is really what we're talking is one of the key barriers, how the IP rights are being used. So essentially, what the Productivity Commission recognised and identified is that copyright was one of the most significant IP barriers. All IP, patents, trademarks are barriers. We know spare parts with trademarks on them are being used to prevent, replacement parts. But copyright and the system of TPMs or digital locks that are placed over the software that's embedded in everyday devices, whether it's your heart monitor, your prosthetic, or your car or kettle or washing machine, it is the fact that software is embedded in them. Copyright law is the regime that protects software, and this is, it's always been an odd fit, but that's the way it is. But the marriage of copyright and the TPM's regime, or technological protection regime, or digital locks, together is really what's locking up the devices and tethering us back to the manufacturers. So they've recognised that it doesn't reflect a true balance of the access to the public. We know that the exceptions are being overridden by what we call the EULAs, or the end-use license agreements that accompany everything we turn on. Your car, your tractor, your laptop. Every time you see one of those screens that says you click and you agree, you're agreeing to software terms. Most of those terms will say you cannot access the software, you cannot repair it, you cannot do anything to that. So that is where the problem is. It's in the private contracts. It's not only the product design, the way things are being made, glued in, special screws, but it is the fact that we can't even work out what spare part is broken if you can't access and understand what error 502 is, or whatever that is. And that is the problem. So Europeans have got a lot of regulation around access to spare parts. It's fantastic. But they're not addressing the IP issue, and that's the software issue of how do I know what's broken on my car when it bricks, when it doesn't work? Because I just get an error code and I have to go back to the manufacturer to find out what that means. So that's the only way I'll find out what spare part I need. So the recommendations are that we should have in Australia a specific fair dealing defence for repair. It would be better, like every other probably review that we've had of copyright law, is that we should adopt the American fair use system. It's broader, more flexible. It's unlikely that that's really going to happen in Australia. I think what's more important is that we have something that we have with respect to backup copies of software, is what we call a prohibition on contracting out of our copyright defences. And that means Section 47H of our Copyright Act says you cannot contract out of making a backup copy of a computer software program, for example. And what that means is no private contract or end-use license agreement can say you cannot do that, okay? Because it makes your contract illegal, unenforceable. We have that for backup software, but we don't have that for any of our defences under our Copyright Law Act. And one of the recommendations, and it's been made a number of times, is that we need to stop companies from contracting out of these balancing exceptions and defences that we've gone over, for hundreds of years, making sure that they're scoped correctly. We have a Marrakesh Treaty, which is essentially a human rights treaty, which gave access to certain printed works and copyright works for people who are blind and visually impaired. That was brought by the World Blind Union. But when you look at issues of access to people with disabilities, does it mean that someone who can get an access to a copyright work to find out how they can repair their wheelchair, but because of the software and the copyright in their wheelchair itself, they can't repair it? They can get the information, the article about it, but they can't actually do the act because of the digital lock that's over the software in their electric wheelchair. So we're seeing this as a real problem. So these three recommendations, all of these recommendations I'm highlighting to you, there has been no government action on. Okay, so the ACCC was asked to undertake a specific inquiry into the mobile phone and tablet market. The ACCC should investigate claims of anti-competitive conduct in repair markets, particularly in medical devices. Medical device market and regulations similarly. The TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, who regulates a lot of the import of medical device and equipment and assistive technologies, don't think it's a problem. Don't see that repair and maintenance and service of these goods that they give approval to come into Australia as a problem. Interestingly, medical devices and assistive technologies comes across both the TGA regulator as well as the ACCC, because a lot of them are just consumer goods. Some wheelchairs are not regulated by the TGA, but they're consumer goods. So nothing is happening in this space. In terms of the environmental waste recommendations, these were a little bit surprising, a little bit odd. One that has some support, but we've yet to see anything, is a product label. This is something that France has done. European Union is following suit, and that is at the point of sale, there will be a label on electronic products or electrical goods, white goods in certain categories, where you can see what repairability or durability that product has in terms of will you be able to access parts, tools and information. The interesting thing about copyright law is that is the reason why we're not getting access. You can get all the spare parts you need, but if you can't get the tools that you need to implement or install those spare parts, it basically circumvents the access to the parts themselves. So this issue around knowing at the point of purchase that you will need software updates, that your lights don't have bulbs that you can replace, for example, or that you'll have to pull your fridge out and turn it off and on and change the temperature to get the water filter working again, or whatever it might be. All of that information should be made available to you so you can make an informed purchase. You may pay more for a product that has better repairability or durability, so you'll get a score out of 10 for things like access to parts, spare parts, information, tools, updates, etc. It's working well in France. The European Union is doing it. Okay. So essentially, this is all that we have from the federal government at the moment. It's just consultation has closed. Federal government is looking at, together, essentially e-waste under 20 kilos going into a product stewardship scheme. And that's essentially capturing more at waste for recycling purposes. And that whole kind of moving up the product life cycle to reuse and repair is really been lost here. Just touching on some of the discussions that we've had today is this repair needs to be seen, it needs to be place-based, it needs this broader, Nathan talked about this movement, this awareness raising that you can do something other than dispose of your goods and buy another one. There's 2,800 repair cafes around the world. They're not only saving stuff from landfill, providing a forum for intergenerational transfer of knowledge and skills between generations. It's wonderful to see. The economic ways, the strengthening of communities have brought people together during times like COVID. We've heard that, but this flourishing ecosystem that we need to see is what I think we saw in our automotive aftermarket when the mum and dad mechanics actually went to see their local members and said, hey, this has to be mandatory, we can't fix cars anymore. We need this to be engaging with everyone, and that's part of that bigger story that we've heard around repair. The social benefits, not only the economic, the environmental, but the social benefits and educational training skills argument is probably what will take repair across the line. I thank you very much.
Okay, cabaret stuff. So we are running just a tiny bit late, but because of that, I thought I would default to an online question because people in the room can ask Leanne questions over lunch. And we do have one question online. Sylvia, are you still able to speak, or would you like me to?
I am able to speak as long as people can tolerate my cat's voice as well.
We love your cat.
Apologize ahead of time. So, yeah, Leanne, thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. I come from the computer industry, and so when you said TPM, my ears perked up. And we had some digital locks that we put in place for user privacy or security or encryption purposes. And it has always been a challenge to both protect an end user's privacy or security and help them, give them the right to repair. And so I'm wondering if you've made some progress on the front in proposing some kind of legislation or legislative wording for how to set expectations for manufacturers in their design process.
Sure. In terms of the actual wording around TPMs, I think Canada is probably the best example, and Anthony Rosborough is your man to talk to, because they've actually got some draft legislation in Canada around copyright amendments and specifically TPM amendments. This issue around security and privacy is a valid one. You know, we've heard it across a range of industries. Certainly John Deere and the tractor manufacturers have raised it around, and there's also issues around environmental emissions concerns. There are ways in which security information can be secured. I think, you know, through manufacturers, TPMs and locks that are used over part of devices. I think what we're seeing is a use of devices, TPMs over the broad device itself, so that you can't even ascertain, as I said, what those problems are with that device. So we know that there have been some instances of manufacturer repair where there have been security and privacy breaches. It's a significant issue, and I think even all right to repair advocates would not be supportive of any safety or privacy or security breaches. I think what the repair movement is looking for is broader access to keep those products in use without jeopardising those issues of security, safety and privacy. But I'd say reach out to Anthony Rosborough and Canada, because they're the closest country I know. European Union is not looking at the IP barriers, but I know that Canada is probably your best bet.